Hey everybody, if you haven't bought a house already, that means you're probably going to in the near future, and you're probably thinking to yourself, how much is reasonable to spend on a house? I know I thought the same thing when I bought my first house, so I Googled it. If you Google how much to pay on a mortgage, it usually says somewhere around 28% of your gross income per month. Yeah, on my first house, I didn't spend 28%. I actually spent more, so I broke the rule, and I'm going to tell you why it was one of the best decisions in real estate that I've made. Alright, to tell you why I broke this rule, I first need to tell you a little bit of the backstory. I had just completed a master's in accounting and I had just gotten a CPA license, and my wife and I had just had our first kid. We were living in a studio apartment at the time. I had just started working for a CPA firm making $50,000 a year. So we were living in a studio apartment with our first kid, and we decided maybe now is the time to look for houses. So really when we were thinking about houses, we really had two options. We could go to a neighborhood that maybe was less desirable and more in our budget, or we could buy a house in a neighborhood that we really like, but it's probably a little bit more expensive and maybe a little outside of our budget. So obviously buying a smaller house or maybe a rundown house or in a house that's in a little bit of a rougher neighborhood would help us follow that 28% rule. And buying a house that was maybe a little bit nicer, didn't need as much work, or maybe in a little bit better of a neighborhood would make it so that we broke the 28% rule. So using the master's degree that I just got in accounting, I decided to do the math. Really what it came down to is option one, buying a cheaper house in maybe a not so nice neighborhood, would make it so that I would be able to save money each paycheck. Option two, on the other hand, would mean that I'd probably need to dip into my savings each month to pay for my mortgage. Yes, I was able to have a savings account after my master's program. I was actually able to go through debt-free. If you want to learn more on how I was able to do that, there is a video in the link in the description. So obviously I had a pretty tough decision to make, whether to move my family into a little bit rougher of a neighborhood but a cheaper house, or buy a more expensive house in a nicer neighborhood. So I did what any responsible person would do when faced with a tough decision. I tried to have somebody else make it for me. So I asked people who I trusted for advice. I assume most people would probably give me the route to say, play it safe, buy the house that's a little more in your budget, that you can live in comfortably and actually save money during it. And that's what I did get from a lot of people, but I had an uncle who said something that surprised me. He told me to buy the biggest house I could afford. The key to his advice is the word afford. He told me to buy the biggest house that I could afford. The word afford means different things to different people. The bank told me what they think I can afford, and by the way, that was way too high. If I had bought a house to the limit of what the bank was willing to lend me, I would have to ride a bike, have no health insurance, and live off rice and beans for years. So like I said before, I was pretty surprised by my uncle's advice, so I kind of asked his reasoning behind it. Why would he tell me to buy the biggest house that I could afford? And what he came back to is the fact that he says he's rarely or if ever lost on real estate. He said if you're willing to hold, real estate historically goes up. With that appreciation, he said 10% on $150,000 versus 10% on $300,000, which is the same appreciation rate. Obviously, one makes a whole lot more money. One makes double than the other one does. 10% on $150,000 is $15,000, while 10% on $300,000 is $30,000. Obviously, I couldn't argue with his logic. It just makes sense that 10% gain on a higher dollar amount means larger gains. I'm all for that. I am all for making more money and being able to provide for my family better and to help others. Alright, so there's a few caveats to this advice that I'd like to go over now. First, don't buy a huge house if you can't afford it. Just like I said before, his main thing in his advice was buy the biggest house that you can afford. Second, do not implement this strategy if you're not willing to hold. By hold, I mean just keep that property and keep paying on it, keep living in it. Because obviously there's ebbs and flows in the market, so if you buy the house and it goes down in price, obviously you don't want to sell it at a loss, so if you aren't willing to hold until the market rebounds and gets higher, then you should not implement this strategy. I also wouldn't implement this strategy if you believe the market is going to decrease. In general, this is pretty rare. I mean, most markets increase in home value over time when it comes to real estate, but there are areas that you may see a decrease for a long period of time, and if you believe you are buying in one of those areas, I would not implement this strategy. Fourth, I wouldn't implement this strategy if you believe your employment is unlikely to continue. Obviously, if you do not have a job, then you're unable to pay for your mortgage, which makes it so that you're going to end up losing your house. So obviously there's always a risk that you may lose your job or that the market may decrease or things like that. But let's try and mitigate as many risks as possible, and then we can handle everything else. All right, for me, so when I implemented this strategy, one, I bought a house that I could afford, meaning I could make the payments, even though it broke the 28% rule. I was also willing to hold for as long as necessary. A lot of that was because I bought a house in a neighborhood that I liked. It's somewhere that I was willing to raise my kids and be able to live with my wife. I was also living in a market that was appreciating. I also got a job with a large CPA firm, so my job stability was very high. My job was also in an industry that sees consistent wage increases year over year. So when I had done the math on buying the more expensive house, year one and year two of buying that house, I actually had to dip into my savings to be able to pay my mortgage. But taking into account future wage increases, by year 3 and 4, I would be going on the other side where I'd actually be able to save a little bit of money. I also didn't throw all my eggs in one basket, so I still contributed to a 401k so that I could get my employer match. Doing those things is what made me more comfortable with implementing the strategy of buying the largest house that I could afford. Obviously, there's always risk in investing, but these risks were something that I was willing to take on because the other things that were in my control weren't risky. So now that we've discussed when to implement this strategy and things to consider before implementing this strategy, let's actually go over my numbers and the result of implementing this strategy. So first, let's go through my numbers. The house that I ended up buying was $270,000. I put $20,000 down and I ended up having mortgage payments of around $1,200 a month. I ended up keeping the house for 23 months, so that ended up being $27,600 in mortgage payments. So really, total money invested was $47,600. But in some ways, you could even call the $1,200 in mortgage payments a sunk cost, because if I wasn't buying a house, I would be paying rent. But for sake of this example, we're going to leave it in there and say, okay, that's money invested. So really, my total investment in this house was $47,600. After owning the house for 23 months, I ended up selling the house for $329,000. That's a total gain of $59,000, the $329 minus the $270 that I paid for it. That shakes out to be right around 21.85% gain. But that's the gain over my purchase price. So now let's calculate the gain on the money that I actually put in. So I had said before that I put in $47,600 over the course of 23 months. So making $59,000 over $47,600 invested is nearly 124% gain. I was able to more than double the money that I invested. This is possible because of leverage. So I used the bank's money to buy the house, which is a much larger investment than the cash that I put in, the $270 versus really the $47,000 that I put in. And because of that, I was able to use their money to have a bigger gain and be able to capitalize on that. So yeah, needless to say, I was pumped. Those 2 years, that was a great return. Probably one of the best returns that I've ever had or ever will have as far as a percentage gain. I definitely don't say this to brag, I just say it as my experience, hopefully to help other people when they are making their decisions as far as real estate and buying a house. So now that we know my actual numbers, let's go over numbers as if I would have bought a house that followed the 28% rule. So the other houses I were looking at were in the $150,000 range. If I would have bought a $150,000 house, I would have still put my $20,000 down, but then I would have had mortgage payments around $754 a month. If I held it for the same period of time, being the 23 months, I would end up having mortgage payments that I would have paid over the course of 23 months of $17,300. That means total cash invested would be right around $37,300. Now, if I would have sold the house at the exact same gain, that 21.85%, then the sell price of my house would be right around $183,000. $183,000 less my purchase price of $150,000 would be a $33,000 gain on the house. So obviously, just looking from it there, $59,000 gain, which is what I actually had, versus a $33,000 gain, which would have been if I would have played it a little more safe. Obviously, I want the $59,000. It is way more than $33,000. But you can also look at it as a rate of return as well. So as mentioned earlier, the actual rate of return on cash that I invested was almost 124%. However, if I had played it safe, I would have invested $37,300 and only made $33,000. So my rate of return would be more right around 87% over the course of 23 months. So obviously a rate of return of 124% versus 87%, the 124 is better. Now, I'm not saying that 87% is bad, because obviously it's not. That's a killer return for 2 years. However, because I was willing to go out of my comfort zone and buy a little bit bigger of a house, I was able to capitalize on a bigger gain and also a bigger rate of return. So obviously buying the bigger house was worth it. There's always going to be risks in investing, but obviously in this one, it paid out in my favor. I was grateful that I was able to listen to the advice and buy a bigger house, one that I could afford still, but allowed me to have a much larger gain. In the future, I'm going to talk more about some of my real estate investing strategies, so please subscribe to the channel and you'll be able to find that content in the near future.